I always believed that marriage meant creating something new together, built on honesty, trust, and equal partnership. When I married Thomas, I thought his family understood that too, especially since they welcomed me with what seemed like open arms at our wedding. What I didn't realize was that in my mother-in-law Margaret's mind, I was just a temporary guest in her son's life. "Remember, dear, this is Thomas's house. He's worked so hard for it," she would say during her visits, as if I were somehow just passing through. But family dynamics can shift dramatically when unexpected truths come to light. And when the property records finally arrived in the mail that rainy Tuesday afternoon, everything Margaret thought she knew about her son's house was about to change forever. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. For 5 years, I, Eliza Chen Walker, had been carefully walking the tightrope of being the ideal daughter-in-law. I'd transformed myself from an outspoken architectural project manager with strong opinions to a woman who carefully measured her words at family gatherings. I learned to make Thomas's favorite childhood recipes according to Margaret's exacting standards. I memorized the complicated family histories and traditions of the prestigious Walker family, whose construction business had built half the luxury homes in Oak Ridge Heights. "Family comes first," Margaret would declare at every holiday dinner, raising her crystal wine glass while her eyes seemed to look right through me. Thomas would squeeze my hand under the table when this happened, a silent apology that I mistook for solidarity. When I married Thomas, I wasn't just marrying the man, I was marrying into the Walker legacy. Their family business, Walker & Sons Construction, had been building custom homes for 3 generations. The annual family strategy retreats were legendary. Each year, the entire family would spend a week at their lake house discussing business plans, family investments, and future projects. For the first 2 years of our marriage, I wasn't invited to these retreats. "It's purely business, Liza," Thomas would explain, kissing my forehead before packing his expensive luggage. "You'd be bored sitting through all those meetings." I accepted this explanation, though it stung. After all, I had a master's degree in architecture and had managed million-dollar construction projects before we met. I understood the business more than anyone realized. By the 3rd year, I received my invitation, not because they finally saw me as family, but because they needed me. Their new eco-friendly housing development was struggling to connect with younger buyers. My background in sustainable architecture and urban planning suddenly made me valuable. I spent that retreat creating their marketing strategy, redesigning floor plans, and recommending sustainable materials that would appeal to environmentally conscious millennials. The development's sales increased by 40% within 3 months. After that, I was included in the annual retreats, though always with an unspoken expectation: make yourself useful. And I did. Year after year, I contributed design insights, managed difficult clients with my diplomatic touch, and even brought in new business connections through my professional network. I believed I was finally earning my place at the table through competence and dedication. I thought I was becoming a Walker in more than just name. Thomas and I had built what looked like a perfect life: a stunning 4-bedroom craftsman home in the prestigious Oak Ridge Heights neighborhood, weekend trips to their family's lake house, membership at the country club, even a feature in Regional Home Design's Power Couples issue. But beneath this polished surface, cracks were beginning to show. Thomas worked increasingly long hours, our conversations growing shorter and more perfunctory. When we did spend time together, his attention was often divided between me and his constantly buzzing phone. "The Westridge project," he'd explain, or "Dad needs these estimates tonight." I accepted these explanations because I understood ambition. I had sacrificed my own career advancement to support his, after all. I'd left my position at a prestigious architectural firm to take a part-time consulting role that allowed me more flexibility to attend Walker family functions and entertain Thomas's clients. What I didn't realize What I refused to see was that I had become just another acquisition in the Walker portfolio. A useful asset maintained as long as I provided value, but never truly part of the family collection. I was the artisan tile in the entryway that complemented the decor, but could be replaced when styles changed. The annual family retreat this year was to be held at Pine Valley Resort in Aspen, a newly renovated luxury lodge that had already hosted celebrities and tech billionaires. The planning had begun months in advance, with Margaret sending her usual detailed itineraries and packing suggestions. I had been excited, researching sustainable building practices in alpine environments and preparing ideas for the family business's environmental initiative. 2 weeks before departure, I sat at our kitchen island finalizing my presentation on integrating renewable energy systems into luxury homes when Thomas arrived home later than usual. He loosened his tie, poured himself a glass of whiskey, and leaned against the counter with an expression I couldn't quite read. "We need to talk about the Aspen trip," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "I'm almost finished with the sustainability presentation," I replied, turning my laptop toward him. "I think your father will be impressed with the cost-benefit analysis for solar integration." Thomas took a long sip of his drink. "That's the thing, Eliza. Mom and Dad think this year's retreat should be focused exclusively on family succession planning. Very private, very sensitive discussions." I waited for him to continue, a strange feeling beginning to form in the pit of my stomach. We think, it might be better if you sit this one out. Just this year." His voice was gentle but firm, as if he were explaining something regrettable but necessary to a child. "Succession planning?" I repeated, my voice surprisingly steady. "I'm your wife, Thomas. Doesn't that make me part of the succession discussion?" He sighed, setting down his glass. "It's complicated. There are things about the family holdings, trust structures that, well, Dad's lawyers have advised a certain level of discretion." "Discretion?" I echoed. "From your wife of 5 years?" Thomas reached for my hand, his wedding band catching the light. "It's just business, Eliza. You understand. Business." In that moment, something crystallized within me, a realization that had been forming for years, but that I had refused to acknowledge. I wasn't family. I was an outsider, tolerated when useful, excluded when convenience demanded it. And Thomas, the man who had vowed to make me his partner in all things, saw nothing wrong with this arrangement. Little did they know, I understood business better than they thought. Much better. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. My dedication to the Walker family hadn't just been about attending their events or learning their customs. It had been a complete reinvention of myself. When I met Thomas at a charity auction for affordable housing in Oak Ridge Heights, I was Eliza Chen, a rising star at Morrison Architectural Group with a reputation for innovative, sustainable designs. My colleagues used to say I could convince the most traditional builders to embrace cutting-edge green technology. I had my own modern loft apartment downtown, a close circle of college friends from architecture school, and a 5-year plan that involved eventually starting my own sustainable design firm. Then came Thomas, with his charismatic smile and family legacy. Our courtship was a whirlwind of weekend trips to wine country and sailing excursions on his family's boat. When he proposed after just 10 months, my friends expressed concern about the speed, but I was certain this wasn't just about love. It was about potential, about building something extraordinary together. The sacrifices began small but multiplied quickly. First, it was moving from my beloved downtown loft to Thomas's Tudor-style home in Oak Ridge Heights. "The commute to Morrison will be brutal from there," I had pointed out. "Why don't you take some time off?" Thomas had suggested. "You've been working so hard. Besides, Mom's charity foundation could use your design expertise for their community center project." That time off stretched into resignation when Margaret made it clear that no Walker spouse maintained a separate career. Divided loyalty leads to divided success, she'd explained over lunch at her country club, her tennis bracelet catching the light as she patted my hand. The family business requires full commitment. So I channeled my ambition into being the perfect Walker spouse. I redesigned our home to better showcase Thomas's collection of local artisan furniture. I organized dinner parties for his business associates, ensuring each event was both impressive and strategically valuable. I accompanied him to industry events, memorizing details about potential clients so I could guide conversations toward successful deals. When Thomas's father needed help redesigning one of their struggling development properties, I spent 3 months developing a comprehensive redesign plan. I worked 14-hour days creating sustainable solutions that would also appeal to luxury buyers. I presented my findings in a detailed report, complete with 3D renderings and material specifications. Richard nodded approvingly. "Not bad for someone without real estate development experience," he'd said before handing the report to his design team without crediting my work. The development's subsequent success was attributed to the Walker vision in the company's year-end newsletter. I swallowed my frustration because that's what family does, isn't it? They contribute without expecting constant recognition. Besides, Thomas had been proud, telling me privately that his father was impressed, even if he wouldn't say it directly. The personal sacrifices were even more significant. At 33, I had wanted to start trying for a baby, but Margaret had pulled me aside during one family dinner. "Darling, children change everything," she'd said, her voice lowered conspiratorially. "Thomas is just about to take over the Westridge development. A pregnancy now would be inconvenient." Thomas had agreed when I'd brought it up later that night. "Mom's right, Eliza. Let's give it another year or 2. The timing isn't right." That had been 3 years ago. Each time I raised the subject, there was always another development, another expansion, another reason to wait. Meanwhile, his sister Rebecca had given birth to her second child, with Margaret flying to Boston to stay with her for a month after the delivery. When I'd mentioned this discrepancy, Thomas had shrugged. "Rebecca's husband isn't directly involved in operations. It's different for us." I had stopped bringing it up. Instead, I channeled my energy into proving my worth to the family in other ways. When Richard's 60th birthday approached, I spent months secretly compiling a leather-bound book of his favorite buildings from around the world, complete with architectural analyses and personal notes from respected architects I knew. When the family foundation needed to raise its profile, I designed an award-winning community center that attracted coverage in architectural magazines and raised twice the expected donations. My own family fell by the wayside as I immersed myself in Walker priorities. I missed my sister's art gallery opening because it conflicted with a client weekend at the lake house. I cut short visits to my parents because Margaret would call with emergencies that somehow always coincided with my rare time away. My college friends' invitations became less frequent as I repeatedly canceled plans for Walker obligations. Father had noticed the change during his last visit to Oak Ridge Heights. "You seem tired, Lizzie," he'd said, using my childhood nickname. "And your designs? I haven't seen any new sketches. Are you still drawing?" "I'm just busy, Dad," I'd replied, showing him the view from our expansive back patio as if the manicured garden were evidence of my contentment. "The family business requires a lot of attention." He'd given me a long look before saying, "Just remember, creating is your oxygen. Without it, you'll suffocate slowly." I had changed the subject, uncomfortable with his perception. The truth was, I had been proud of my ability to adapt, to transform myself into someone the Walkers could accept. Each sacrifice felt like an investment in our shared future. Each compromise seemed like a stepping stone toward true belonging. I had believed that eventually there would be a return on these investments. Recognition, inclusion, genuine acceptance as a Walker. 5 years of carefully calculated choices. 5 years of putting their needs before my own. 5 years of proving myself again and again. And now, with a single conversation about the Aspen trip, Thomas had made it clear. No amount of sacrifice would ever be enough. I would always be the outsider. Useful, but ultimately expendable. As I sat at our kitchen island, watching Thomas fidget with his empty whiskey glass, I realized that the person I had become, this polished, accommodating version of Eliza, was unrecognizable to the ambitious architect I had once been. I had given the Walkers everything, even pieces of myself I hadn't known were negotiable. And what had I received in return? A beautiful house that never quite felt like home. A husband who viewed our marriage as secondary to family strategy. And now, the final indignity. Exclusion from a family retreat because I wasn't family enough to be trusted with sensitive discussions. "It's not like you'd enjoy it anyway," Thomas continued, reaching for the whiskey bottle to pour himself another drink. "You know how intense these planning sessions get. Dad and Uncle James arguing over portfolio diversification, Mom micromanaging every meal." He offered a smile that was probably meant to be reassuring. I kept my expression neutral, though my mind was racing. When exactly was this decision made? Thomas busied himself with adding a single ice cube to his glass. "We discussed it during the board meeting last Thursday." Last Thursday, the day I'd brought lunch to his office because he'd mentioned having back-to-back meetings. I sat in the reception area for 45 minutes before his assistant told me he was unavailable. He'd texted later, "Sorry, babe, meetings ran long. See you at home." So everyone knows except me, Rebecca, David, your cousins. They all know I'm not invited? Thomas winced slightly. "It's not a big deal, Eliza. You're making it sound like some sort of conspiracy. What am I supposed to do while you're all in Aspen for a week?" "Actually, that's the other thing," Thomas said, his tone brightening as if he were about to offer good news. "Mom suggested you could use the time to oversee the renovation at the Silver Lake property. The contractors have fallen behind schedule, and someone needs to be on site to make decisions." The Silver Lake property, the massive mid-century modern house the Walkers had purchased last year as an investment, which needed extensive updates before it could be flipped. The property that sat empty and partially gutted, an hour's drive from our home, in an area where I knew no one. "You want me to house sit a construction site while you're at a luxury resort?" Thomas frowned. "It's not house sitting, Eliza. It's project management. You're good at that sort of thing. You've got an eye for detail." "So I'm good enough to supervise contractors, but not good enough to be included in family succession planning." "That's not fair," Thomas said, his voice hardening slightly. "This is business." "It's a family business," I countered. "And apparently, I'm not family." Thomas set his glass down with a sharp click against the marble countertop. "You're being dramatic. It's one trip." "It's not about the trip, Thomas." He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, a gesture I once found endearing, but now recognized as a signal of his impatience. "What is it about, then? Please enlighten me." I wanted to tell him everything. How I felt perpetually on probation with his family, how I'd sacrifice my own ambitions to support his, how I'd postponed motherhood because his mother thought it inconvenient. But looking at him standing there, defensive and irritated rather than understanding, I knew he wouldn't hear me. "Not really." "Never mind," I said quietly. "When do you leave?" Relief washed over his features. He thought the storm had passed. "Next Friday. The flight leaves at 10 a.m. I nodded, already formulating questions he wouldn't expect. "Who's handling the Westridge client meetings while you're gone?" "Jessica," he replied, referring to his new assistant. "She'll coordinate with the sales team." "And the Mapleton development deal?" "That should close before we leave. But if it doesn't, the lawyers will handle it." He seemed pleased by my apparent interest in business details rather than the personal slight. What about the downtown revitalization project? Wasn't there some issue with the Historical Preservation Committee? Thomas waved a dismissive hand. Dad's taking care of it. Everything's under control, Eliza. The world won't stop turning just because we take a week away. No, the world wouldn't stop turning, but something had shifted in mine. A tectonic movement beneath the surface that Thomas couldn't feel. I think I'll go downstairs for a while, I said, sliding off the bar stool. I need to clear my head. Thomas nodded absently, already reaching for his phone, which had begun to vibrate. It's Dad, he said, not bothering to look up as I left the room. I walked slowly to the basement, a space I had claimed as my home office when we first moved in. Thomas rarely ventured down there, preferring the sunlit study on the main floor for his work. The basement had become my sanctuary, though I spent less and less time there as Walker family obligations consumed my schedule. As I descended the stairs, the familiar smell of paper and pencil shavings welcomed me. This was the one space in the house that still felt like mine. My drafting table stood by the window, covered in dust now. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with architectural books and journals I hadn't opened in months. In the corner sat boxes of files I'd brought from my old loft, relics of my previous life that I couldn't bring myself to discard. I sank into my desk chair, fingers drumming against the wooden surface. The conversation with Thomas replayed in my mind, each word cutting deeper upon reflection. 5 years of marriage, and this was where we stood. Me, an outsider in my own home, useful but not essential. Absently, I pulled open the bottom drawer of my desk, where I kept old project files. My fingers brushed against a manila envelope I didn't immediately recognize. I pulled it out, frowning slightly at the unfamiliar weight. Inside was a stack of documents: our house deed, mortgage papers, insurance policies, copies Thomas had asked me to file away years ago when we first moved in. I'd forgotten they were there. I started to return them to the drawer when a name on the deed caught my eye. Not Thomas Walker, not Thomas and Eliza Walker, but Eliza Chen. My maiden name, listed as the sole owner. My heart began to race as I spread the papers across my desk, scanning each document with growing disbelief. The house, our house, was in my name alone. The mortgage, the property tax statements, everything was registered solely to Eliza Chen. How was this possible? Thomas had handled all the paperwork when we bought the house. He'd told me it was a gift, part of our marriage arrangement. A house purchased with a combination of his savings and a contribution from his parents. I'd signed papers, of course, but there had been so many, and Thomas had simply pointed to the signature lines, explaining each document in the vaguest terms. Just legal formalities, he'd said. Trust me, I deal with this stuff every day. Remembered now, with growing clarity, that I'd never actually seen the final deed. Thomas had said he would file everything, and I had trusted him. After all, he was in real estate development. This was his area of expertise. But here was the evidence, in black and white. The Tudor-style home in Oak Ridge Heights that Margaret always referred to as Thomas's house belonged entirely to me. And according to the mortgage statements, the monthly payments came from an account in my name, an account I didn't recognize. With trembling hands, I reached for my laptop, navigating to our bank's website. I logged into my personal account, the one I rarely used since merging finances with Thomas. There was my regular checking account with its modest balance, and beside it, another account I didn't remember opening. When I clicked on it, I nearly gasped. The account contained over $750,000, with regular monthly deposits dating back 5 years, since right after our wedding. Each deposit was labeled simply Walker Holdings Distribution. None of this made sense. Thomas had always managed our finances, insisting it was easier given his business background. I received a small allowance from our joint account for personal expenses, but otherwise, I had little involvement in our financial matters. As I dug deeper into the files, more inconsistencies emerged. Tax returns showed deductions for a business entity called Chen Design Group LLC, a company I had no knowledge of. Investment statements revealed a portfolio worth over $1.2 million, all in my name. It was as if I had been living a financial double life without my knowledge. A life where I was wealthy, independent, a property owner and business owner on paper, while in reality, I believed myself to be dependent on the Walker family's goodwill. But why? Why would Thomas create this elaborate financial structure in my name while letting me believe I was financially dependent on him and his family? And more importantly, why would he and Margaret constantly refer to this as his house, when legally, undeniably, it was mine? As the pieces slowly began to connect, a chill ran through me. The succession planning that was too sensitive to include me in. The constant reminders that I was in Thomas's house. The careful management of my career, my time, even my reproductive choices. Control. It had always been about control. I barely slept that night. As Thomas snored softly beside me, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing through 5 years of memories, now viewed through a different lens. Small comments from Margaret, offhand remarks from Richard, Thomas's insistence on managing our finances, all took on new significance in light of what I'd discovered. By morning, I had resolved to understand the full extent of this deception. I waited until Thomas left for work, kissing him goodbye as if nothing had changed, as if my world hadn't been turned upside down. The moment his car disappeared down the driveway, I returned to the basement. I spent the morning methodically going through every file, every document, trying to piece together this puzzle. The more I discovered, the more questions emerged. Chen Design Group LLC was registered 3 months after our wedding, with me listed as the sole proprietor and Thomas as the registered agent. The company had been filing tax returns every year, showing a modest but consistent profit from consulting services to Walker & Sons Construction. The company had an office address, a downtown location I'd never visited. It had a business bank account with a healthy balance. It even had a website, though it was bare bones, describing architectural and design services, but featuring none of my actual work. It was a shell, a legal fiction. But why? What purpose did it serve? I needed professional advice. With trembling hands, I reached for my phone and called the one person I knew would help without judgment, my college roommate, Sophia Lynn, now a partner at Blackwell & Associates, one of the city's top law firms specializing in business and real estate law. "Eliza? Is everything okay?" Sophia's voice was concerned. We hadn't spoken in months, not since I'd canceled our lunch plans for the 3rd time to attend a Walker family function. "I'm not sure," I admitted. "I need your help, professionally. Can I see you today? It's important." There was a slight pause before she answered, her tone shifting to businesslike. "I have a cancellation at 2 Salem. Can you come to my office?" "I'll be there," I promised. "And Sophia, thank you." Next, I called Jin Park, a forensic accountant I'd met through a charity project years ago. I explained that I needed help understanding some financial structures without going into detail. He agreed to meet me after my appointment with Sophia. As I prepared to leave the house, my phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. "Eliza, dear, I need you to review the paint samples for the Silver Lake property today. I've left them with my assistant. Please pick them up this afternoon." The presumption in her message that I would drop everything to fulfill her request would have seemed normal just yesterday. Today, it made my blood boil. I texted back, "Sorry, I have appointments all day. I can look at them tomorrow." Her response was immediate. "This is time-sensitive, Eliza. The contractors need decisions." I turned off my phone. Sophia's office was in a gleaming downtown tower, a world away from the Tudor-style home in Oak Ridge Heights. As her assistant led me into her corner office, I felt like I was stepping back into my old life, the professional world I'd left behind for the Walkers. "Lizzie," Sophia said, rising from behind her desk to embrace me. She was the only one who still called me by my college nickname. "It's been too long." "I know. I'm sorry I've been so absent." She waved away my apology. "What's going on? You sounded worried on the phone." I placed the manila envelope on her desk. "I need you to look at these documents and tell me what they mean." "Legally, I mean." Sophia raised an eyebrow, but opened the envelope without comment. She spread the papers methodically across her desk, her expression growing more serious as she examined each one. Finally, she looked up at me. "Eliza, do you understand what these documents show?" "I think so," I said quietly. "But I need to be sure. According to these records, you own your house outright. The mortgage is in your name, paid from an account in your name. You also appear to own a business, Chen Design Group LLC, which has been operating for 5 years. She leaned back in her chair. "Did you know about any of this?" I shook my head. "Thomas handled all the paperwork when we bought the house. He told me his parents had helped with the down payment, that it was a wedding gift from the Walkers. I signed documents, but I never saw the final deed." I hesitated. "And I definitely never established a design company." Sophia's expression darkened. "Eliza, if you didn't set up this company or authorize these accounts, we're potentially looking at identity theft, fraud, or at the very least, serious financial impropriety." "By my husband," I said, the words feeling strange on my tongue. "Yes." She drummed her fingers on the desk. "The question is why? What purpose does this serve?" I shared my suspicions about control, about being kept dependent while actually being financially independent on paper. Sophia listened intently, taking notes. "There are several possibilities," she said finally. "Tax advantages, liability protection, asset hiding. But given what you've told me about the Walker family dynamics, I suspect it might be related to their business succession planning." "What do you mean?" "Family businesses often have complex ownership structures, especially when transitioning between generations. If Thomas is positioned to take over significant aspects of the business, there might be tax or liability reasons to have assets in your name rather than his. It's a common strategy, though usually done with the full knowledge and consent of both spouses." My meeting with Jin Park at a nearby coffee shop only confirmed Sophia's suspicions. He reviewed the financial documents with practiced efficiency, occasionally making notes on a small pad. "This is a classic asset protection structure," he explained. "By putting the house and business in your name, with you as the sole owner, they're creating a liability firewall. If Walker & Sons were ever sued or faced significant financial troubles, these assets would theoretically be protected." "But why not tell me?" I asked, still struggling to understand. Jin looked uncomfortable. "I can only speak to the financial structure, not the intentions behind it. But from what you've described—" He hesitated. "Control is certainly one possibility. By keeping you in the dark, they maintain power over the arrangement, even though legally, these assets are yours." As I drove home, the pieces were beginning to fit together, forming a picture I didn't want to see. The Walkers had built an elaborate financial fiction, placing assets in my name while making me believe I was dependent on them. Margaret's constant reminders that I was living in Thomas's house weren't just annoying, they were deliberate lies. I pulled into our driveway, staring at the Tudor facade of the house I now knew was legally mine. 5 years of feeling like a guest in my own home. 5 years of deferring to Margaret's decorating preferences and Thomas's decisions because I believed I was living in their generosity. The anger that had been simmering all day suddenly boiled over. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, fighting back tears of rage and betrayal. This wasn't just about control. It was about systematic deception, about making me believe I was something less than I was, keeping me grateful and compliant through carefully constructed lies. My phone, which I'd turned back on after my meetings, buzzed with a text from Thomas. "Mom says you're not answering her messages. The Silver Lake decisions can't wait, Eliza. What appointments? Could possibly be more important than family business?" Family business. The irony was almost too much to bear. The succession planning I wasn't family enough to be included in apparently involved assets placed in my name without my knowledge. For the first time in 5 years, I saw with perfect clarity what I needed to do. And it started with reclaiming what was legally mine. The next morning, instead of seeing Thomas off with my usual kiss and reminder about dinner, I told him I needed to run errands. "I'll be gone most of the day," I said casually, pouring coffee into a travel mug. "Don't wait up if you're working late." He barely looked up from his phone. "Don't forget about those paint samples for Mom." "I won't," I lied, knowing I had no intention of picking them up. As soon as Thomas left, I changed into a crisp white blouse and tailored black pants, clothes from my professional wardrobe that had hung untouched in my closet for years. I pulled my hair back into a sleek bun, applied minimal makeup, and put on the pearl earrings my father had given me when I graduated from architecture school. The woman in the mirror looked familiar, yet strange, more like the Eliza Chen who had once confidently presented designs to corporate clients than the Eliza Walker who arranged dinner parties and deferred to her mother-in-law's opinions. My first stop was the downtown address listed for Chen Design Group LLC. The building was a renovated warehouse in the Arts District, now housing offices for creative professionals. According to the directory in the lobby, Suite 305 belonged to my company, a company I'd never set foot in. With a mixture of trepidation and indignation, I took the elevator to the 3rd floor. Suite 305 had frosted glass doors with Chen Design Group etched in simple, elegant lettering. I tried the handle, expecting it to be locked, but to my surprise, it opened. The office beyond was small but well-appointed, a reception area with a desk and modern chairs leading to a larger space, with drafting tables, a conference area, and a private office in the back. The walls displayed framed architectural renderings. My work from before my marriage, I realized with a shock. Projects I'd completed at Morrison, carefully mounted and displayed as if this had been my working studio all along. A young woman looked up from the reception desk, surprise evident on her face. "Mrs. Walker, we weren't expecting you today." I stared at her, momentarily speechless. There was someone working here? In my non-existent company? "I'm sorry," I managed finally. "You are?" "Mia Reynolds," she said, looking confused. "Your office manager? I've been here for 3 years." 3 years? Someone had been running this office in my name for 3 years and I'd never known. "Of course, Mia," I said, attempting to sound normal. "I'm just dropping by unexpectedly. Could you give me a moment alone? I need to check on some files." "Certainly." She stood, gathering her purse. "I was about to get coffee anyway. Would you like anything?" "No, thank you." As soon as she left, I began searching the office systematically. The filing cabinets contained organized records of projects purportedly completed by Chen Design Group, most of them small consulting jobs for Walker & Sons Construction. My signature appeared on countless documents I'd never seen before, a near-perfect forgery that nonetheless lacked the slight leftward tilt of my actual handwriting. The computer on the desk was password protected, but when I tried my usual password, AEE, combination of my birth date and my mother's maiden name, it opened immediately. The email inbox was active, with messages going back years, all handled by Eliza Chen, but clearly written by someone else, possibly Mia. In the private office, I found more clues. A framed photo of Thomas and me from our wedding day sat on the desk. Architectural journals were arranged neatly on bookshelves. A potted succulent that matched the one in my home office sat in the window. It was a perfect replica of what my office might have looked like if I'd continued my career. A carefully constructed fiction, maintained for years without my knowledge, in Dao. The bottom drawer of the desk I found what I was looking for, a folder labeled Legal and Banking. Inside were account details, checkbooks, and corporate credit cards in my name. Everything necessary to run a business I didn't know existed. I was photographing documents with my phone when I heard Mia return. Quickly, I slipped the folder into my bag and went out to meet her. "Mrs. Walker?" Mr. Thomas called, she said, setting a coffee cup on her desk. "He asked if you'd stopped by. Should I let him know you're here?" The realization hit me like a physical blow. Thomas kept tabs on this place. He knew where I was, even now. "No need," I said, forcing a smile. "I was just leaving. But Mia, I'm curious. How often does Mr. Walker check in with you?" She seemed puzzled by the question. "Every morning, usually. He reviews the consultancy reports before they go to his father." She hesitated. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Walker? You seem different today." "Everything's fine," I assured her. "I'm just making some changes to how I manage my time. Speaking of which, I'll be taking a more active role in the business from now on. Could you email me the current project files so I can review them at home?" "Of course," she said, still looking confused. "Should I use your usual email or—" "My personal email would be better," I said, writing it down for her. "And Mia, let's keep this between us for now. I'd like to surprise Mr. Walker with some new ideas." She nodded, clearly uncomfortable with the secrecy but unwilling to question her boss, a woman she'd apparently been working for, under someone else's direction, for 3 years. As I left the building, my phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. "Mom says you still haven't picked up the paint samples. Where are you? Jessica saw your car downtown." So, he was tracking me now. I wondered how often he'd done this before, checking on my movements, making sure I stayed within the boundaries he'd set. Instead of responding, I drove to the bank listed on the Chen Design Group documents. With my ID and the account information I'd found, I was able to speak with a personal banker who knew me, or rather, knew Eliza Chen, the architect. "Mrs. Walker," he greeted me warmly. "It's been a while since you've come in personally. How can I help you today?" "I'd like to review my accounts," I said. "All of them." The banker, David according to his nameplate, pulled up my information on his computer. "Of course. You have your business checking and savings accounts, your personal accounts, and the investment portfolio Mr. Walker set up for you. Which would you like to start with?" "Actually, I'd like to make some changes to the account authorizations," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I want to be the only person with access to these accounts going forward." David looked surprised. "Currently, you and Mr. Walker both have signatory authority on all accounts, except the business accounts, which are solely in your name. Are you sure you want to change that arrangement?" "Absolutely sure," I said. "And I'd like new cards issued with new pins. I seem to have misplaced mine." 2 hours later, I left the bank with complete control over assets I hadn't known I possessed until yesterday. I'd moved substantial amounts from the shared accounts to my personal accounts, changed all passwords and security questions, and arranged for statements to be sent only to a new email address I'd created. It wouldn't take Thomas long to discover what I'd done, but I didn't need long. I just needed enough time to implement the plan that was forming in my mind, a plan to reclaim not just my financial independence, but my identity. My next stop was a locksmith, where I had the locks on my house changed, paying extra for same-day service. Then I visited a security company, arranging for a new alarm system to be installed the following day. By late afternoon, I was sitting in Sophia's office again, describing what I'd found and the steps I'd taken. Her expression shifted from concern to admiration as I outlined my discoveries and actions. "You've been busy," she said when I finished. "What's your next move?" I leaned forward, a sense of purpose filling me that I hadn't felt in years. I want to know why. Why go to all this trouble to make me think I was dependent when legally I owned everything? And why exclude me from succession planning discussions? When apparently, I'm a key part of their asset protection strategy? Sophia tapped her pen against her legal pad. I could file for discovery as part of a potential legal action. That would give us access to Walker and Sons records, communications about these arrangements. Would that tip them off? Definitely. But at this point, do you care? They've been manipulating you for years, Eliza. I considered this. Not yet. There's something I need to do first. Which is? I smiled, feeling a surge of confidence that had long been suppressed. I'm going to find out what exactly is in those succession planning documents they're so determined to hide from me. It was nearly 8:00 p.m. when I returned home. The locksmith had finished his work, and I'd sent him on his way with a generous tip for his discretion. I sat in my car for a moment, mentally preparing myself for the confrontation that was about to occur. Thomas's car was already in the driveway. A light burned in the upstairs window of his home office. I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and walked to the front door of my house, and used my new key to enter. The foyer was dark, but I could hear Thomas moving around upstairs. I deliberately set my keys down loudly on the entry table, announcing my presence. "Eliza?" Thomas called from above. "Where have you been? I've been trying to reach you all day." "I had appointments," I replied, my voice steady and clear. "I told you that this morning." Footsteps sounded on the stairs, and then Thomas appeared, his expression a mixture of irritation and concern. "Appointments? All day? Mom is furious. The contractors needed those paint decisions today." "Margaret's preferences for the Silver Lake property weren't my priority today," I said, removing my jacket and hanging it in the closet. "I had more important matters to attend to." Thomas frowned, noticing my professional attire. "What appointments? And why are you dressed like that?" "I went to the office," I said simply, watching his face carefully. Confusion flickered across his features, then wariness. "What office?" "Chen Design Group, Suite 305 in the Mason Building downtown." I maintained eye contact, refusing to look away. "My office, apparently. The one with my name on the door and my employee, Mia, working inside. The office you check in with every morning." The color drained from Thomas's face, but he recovered quickly. "Eliza, I can explain." "I'm sure you can," I interrupted. "You can probably explain a lot of things. Why the house I've been living in for 5 years is in my name alone. Why there's an account with over $750,000 in it that I didn't know existed. Why have you and your mother been referring to this as your house when legally it's mine?" Thomas ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of agitation I knew well. "It's complicated, Eliza. It's part of our family's asset protection strategy. I was going to tell you eventually." "Eventually?" I echoed. "It's been 5 years, Thomas. 5 years of me believing I was financially dependent on you and your family. 5 years of your mother reminding me that I'm living in your house, using your generosity." "Mom doesn't know the details," he said quickly. "She just knows we arrange things to protect family assets." That stopped me short. "Margaret doesn't know the house is in my name?" Thomas shook his head. "No. Only Dad, the lawyers, and I know. The full structure. Mom just knows we set up protection strategies for key assets." I digested this information, mentally recalibrating. If Margaret didn't know the truth, then her constant references to Thomas's house weren't deliberate lies. They were assertions she believed to be true. That didn't excuse her behavior, but it placed it in a different context. "So your mother genuinely believes I'm living in your house, benefiting from Walker family generosity, when in fact, I'm the legal owner of everything." Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "It's not that simple, Eliza. Yes, things are in your name, but it's a legal structure, not actual ownership in the sense you're thinking." "Tell that to the property records," I countered. "Tell that to the bank where I spent 2 hours today changing account authorizations. Tell that to the locksmith who just installed new locks on my house. His head snapped up. You changed the locks? I did, I confirmed. I also changed all the banking passwords, security questions, and contact information. I've taken control of my assets, Thomas. Assets I didn't know I had until yesterday. Thomas stared at me, his expression shifting, from shock to anger. You had no right to do that. Those arrangements were made for family protection. You can't just— I can, and I did, I interrupted, a new steel in my voice. I have every legal right to manage my own property and finances. The fact that you're shocked by this only proves how completely you've excluded me from decisions that directly affect me. This isn't about exclusion, Thomas insisted, his voice rising. It's about security, about protecting our future. The legal structure works better this way. If you'd been in business longer, you'd understand that. The condescension in his tone ignited a fresh spark of anger. I understand perfectly well. I spent the day with a corporate attorney and a forensic accountant. I know exactly what you've been doing and why. What I don't know is why you kept it all secret from me. Your wife, allegedly your partner. Thomas paced the foyer, agitation evident in every movement. You're overreacting. This is standard practice in family businesses. Assets get distributed in ways that provide the most protection. And you didn't think I deserved to know that I was the owner of record for our home? That I had accounts worth millions in my name? That you were running a company called Chen Design Group using my professional identity without my knowledge or consent? He stopped pacing, facing me directly. It was easier this way. Cleaner. You weren't interested in the financial details. I wasn't interested, I repeated incredulously. You actively discouraged my involvement, Thomas. You told me not to worry about it, that you would handle everything. You created a situation where I believed I was dependent on you, when legally I owned everything. Thomas's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at it, then back at me. It's Dad. He's probably heard from the bank about the account changes. Are you going to answer it? I asked. Not right now. He shoved the phone back in his pocket. Eliza, we need to fix this. Whatever you've done today, we can undo it. We can go back to the way things were. The way things were. The words hung in the air between us, crystallizing the fundamental disconnect. Thomas saw nothing wrong with the elaborate deception they'd constructed around me. He genuinely believed we could, and should, return to a status quo where I was, kept ignorant of my own financial reality. There's no going back, Thomas, I said quietly. Not now that I know the truth. But there is going forward, with honesty and transparency. What does that mean exactly? His tone was wary. It means I want full disclosure. I want to see the succession planning documents that were too sensitive to include me in. I want to understand exactly how my name and identity have been used in your family's financial strategies. And I want the truth about why you've gone to such lengths to keep me in the dark. Thomas's expression hardened. Those documents are confidential. Family business. I am family, I reminded him. At least that's what you claim when it's convenient. And more importantly, I'm apparently a key component of this succession plan, given the assets placed in my name. I have a right to know what's happening with my own life. It's not that simple, he insisted. Then explain it to me, I challenged. Make me understand why you and your family found it necessary to construct this elaborate fiction around me. Thomas checked his watch, a nervous gesture. Not tonight, Eliza. It's late, and this is complex. We should discuss it tomorrow with Dad and the lawyers present. So you need reinforcements to explain to your wife why you've been lying to her for 5 years? His jaw tightened. I haven't been lying. I've been protecting our interests. By forging my signature on documents? By running a company in my name without my knowledge? By making me believe I was financially dependent when I wasn't? I shook my head. Thomas, those are lies. Elaborate, carefully constructed lies. The buzz of his phone interrupted us again. This time, Thomas pulled it out and grimaced at the screen. "It's Mom. She's coming over." "Perfect," I said, surprising myself with how calm I felt. I'd love to have a conversation with Margaret about whose house this actually is. Thomas's eyes widened. "Eliza, don't. She doesn't know—" "Exactly," I cut in. "She doesn't know that. All her condescending comments about me living in her son's house have been based on a fiction you and your father created. Don't you think it's time she learned the truth?" Fear flashed across Thomas's face. Not fear of me, but fear of the coming confrontation, of the carefully constructed Walker family dynamics being disrupted. For the first time in our marriage, I saw uncertainty in his eyes, a recognition that he was no longer fully in control of the narrative. "What do you want?" he asked finally. "What will it take to resolve this quietly?" I looked at him, this man I had loved, had believed in, had trusted with my life and future. In that moment, I realized how completely that trust had been betrayed, not in a single act, but in thousands of small decisions over years to keep me dependent, compliant, grateful for scraps of inclusion in a family that had used my identity for their own purposes. "The truth," I said simply. "All of it. No more secrets, no more manipulation. And once I have that, I'll decide what happens next." The sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the tension. Margaret had arrived, undoubtedly expecting to find her dutiful daughter-in-law properly chastened for neglecting the paint samples. She was in for quite a surprise. The doorbell rang, its cheerful chime a surreal counterpoint to the tension filling the house. Thomas glanced at me, a silent plea in his eyes. I ignored it, walking deliberately to the door and opening it wide. Margaret Walker stood on the doorstep, perfectly coiffed as always, a leather portfolio tucked under her arm. Her expression of practiced displeasure faltered slightly when she saw me, not the contrite daughter-in-law she had expected, but a composed professional woman who met her gaze steadily. "Eliza," she said, recovering quickly. "I see you finally returned from your appointments." She pronounced the word with barely concealed skepticism. "I brought the paint samples since you couldn't be bothered to pick them up. The contractors need decisions immediately." "Hello, Margaret," I replied, not stepping aside to let her in. "I'm afraid this isn't a good time for paint discussions." Her eyebrows rose. "Not a good time? The Silver Lake project is a Walker family investment. It doesn't wait for your convenience." "Actually," I said, my voice calm but firm. "Right now, Thomas and I are discussing why the house we're standing in, the one you've consistently referred to as Thomas's house, is legally owned solely by me." Margaret's perfectly lined lips parted in surprise. She looked past me to Thomas, who hovered anxiously in the foyer. "What nonsense is this?" "Why don't you come in?" I suggested, stepping aside at last. "It seems there are several things about the Walker family finances that might surprise you." Thomas moved forward. "Mom, it's complicated. Dad and I set up some asset protection structures years ago." "In my name," I interjected. "Without my knowledge." Margaret stepped into the foyer, her gaze flicking between Thomas and me. "I don't understand. Thomas, what is she talking about?" "Maybe we should all sit down," he suggested, gesturing toward the living room. "I prefer to stand," I said, closing the front door. "This won't take long." Margaret set her portfolio on the entry table with deliberate precision. "Someone had better explain. What's going on?" "It's simple, really," I said. "Yesterday, I discovered that this house, the one you've been referring to as Thomas's house for 5 years, is legally owned by me alone. The deed, the mortgage, everything is in my name. I also discovered a company called Chen Design Group that's been operating in my name, with employees I've never met, an office I've never visited, and contracts I've never signed." Margaret turned to Thomas, her expression a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "Is this true?" Thomas ran a hand through his hair. It's a legal structure, Mom. Dad thought it would be best to put certain assets in Eliza's name for protection from potential business liabilities. It's standard practice in family companies. And you didn't tell me? Margaret's voice was sharp, but I couldn't tell if her anger was directed at the deception itself or merely at being excluded from it. Dad didn't want to complicate things, Thomas explained. The fewer people who know the details, the cleaner the separation for legal purposes. So Richard knows about this? Margaret's shoulders stiffened. He and you decided to put family assets in her name, and neither of you thought to inform me? The revelation of her own exclusion from these decisions seemed to hit Margaret harder than the fact that they had been using my identity without my consent. How telling, I thought, that her first concern was her own position in the family hierarchy, not the ethics of what had been done. It was a protection strategy, Thomas repeated, his voice taking on an edge of desperation. Nothing has actually changed. The house, the money, everything still functions as family assets. Except that legally, they're mine, I pointed out. Which is why I was able to change the banking authorizations today and have the locks changed. Margaret's head snapped toward me. You did what? I took control of what is legally mine, I said simply. After discovering that I've been lied to for 5 years, it seemed prudent. Margaret turned to Thomas again, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. Fix this, now. It's not that simple, Mom. It is that simple, she cut in. Call your father, call the lawyers. Whatever this arrangement was, it clearly isn't working. She cast a disapproving glance my way. If Eliza can't be trusted to understand family business necessities, then different arrangements will need to be made. The dismissive tone, the automatic assumption that I was the problem rather than the victim of their deception, it was so characteristic of Margaret that I almost laughed. Margaret, I said, drawing her attention back to me. I understand family business necessities perfectly well. What I don't understand is why your son and husband felt it necessary to keep me in the dark about my own legal and financial position, while simultaneously making me believe I was dependent on Walker family generosity. Margaret waved a hand dismissively. These are complex legal structures, Eliza. They're not meant to be taken so literally. The law takes them quite literally, I replied. As does the bank and the property records office and the Business Registration Bureau. On paper, the only place that matters legally, I own this house, substantial financial assets, and a design firm that bears my maiden name. The question is, why was I the only one who didn't know that? Thomas stepped between us, as if physically separating his mother and me might diffuse the situation. Let's all calm down. There's a reasonable explanation for all of this. I'd love to hear it, I said. As would I, Margaret added frostily. Thomas looked from one of us to the other, clearly caught between two forces he'd never expected to find himself opposing simultaneously. It was all for protection, he began again. Dad noticed early on that Walker & Sons was growing rapidly, expanding into more complex development projects with greater potential liability. He wanted to ensure that certain family assets were sheltered. And my name was convenient, I said. You were newly married into the family, Thomas explained. With no previous connections to Walker & Sons, it created a clean legal separation. But why not tell me? I pressed. Thomas hesitated, glancing at his mother. Dad thought it would be simpler if you weren't directly involved in the details. If there was ever an issue, if anyone ever questioned the arrangement, your genuine lack of knowledge would be valuable legally. So you deliberately kept me ignorant as part of your legal strategy? I clarified, the full implications sinking in. You made me believe I was financially dependent on you as a business tactic? Margaret made an impatient sound. You're making this far more dramatic than it needs to be, Eliza. Many families use similar arrangements. The point is to protect shared assets, not to, what was it you said? Keep you dependent? Then why all the comments about me living in Thomas's house? I asked her directly. Why the constant reminders that I was benefiting from Walker family generosity? If this was just a normal business arrangement, why make me feel like a guest in what is legally my own home? Margaret's eyes narrowed. I have no idea what you're talking about. I've certainly never suggested you were a guest here. No, you've just reminded me at every opportunity that this is Thomas's house, that the Walkers take care of their own, that I should be grateful for the lifestyle provided to me. I met her gaze steadily, all while knowing, or at least believing, that I had no financial independence of my own. That's absurd, Margaret scoffed. You're twisting normal family conversations into some sort of conspiracy. Thomas, are you going to let her speak to me this way in your— She caught herself, but not before I saw the flash of uncertainty in her eyes. In this house? It's my house, Margaret, I said quietly. Legally, undeniably. The house you're standing in belongs to me. The question is whether you can accept that reality, or whether you'll continue to pretend otherwise. Thomas's phone buzzed yet again. This time he answered it, stepping a few paces away. Yes, Dad. I know. She found out about everything. Yes, the house, the accounts, Chen Design Group, all of it. She's already been to the bank. Yes, Mom's here too. As he spoke, I watched Margaret's face. The initial shock and disbelief had given way to calculation. I could almost see her mind working, reassessing the dynamics, adjusting her approach to this unexpected shift in the balance of power. Eliza, she said, her tone suddenly conciliatory. I think we've gotten off on the wrong foot here. Perhaps I didn't fully understand the legal arrangements my husband and son put in place. But surely you can see that this was all done with the best intentions for the family. Our family, which includes you. The abrupt change in tactics was so transparent it was almost insulting. 5 years, Margaret, I replied. For 5 years, you've treated me as an outsider who needed to earn her place in the Walker family. Now that you realize I legally own assets you thought were yours, suddenly I'm family? Margaret's smile tightened. You've always been family, dear. Perhaps there have been misunderstandings between us, but that doesn't change the fundamental fact that we're all Walkers here. Actually, I said, according to all those documents your son and husband arranged, I'm still Eliza Chen, owner of Chen Design Group, homeowner, and financially independent. The question is, what happens next? Thomas ended his call and turned back to us, his expression grim. Dad's on his way over with the lawyers. He says we need to resolve this tonight. The next half hour passed in tense silence. Margaret settled, herself in the living room, her posture rigid, occasionally shooting pointed glances at me when she thought I wasn't looking. Thomas alternated between pacing and checking his phone, clearly anxious about his father's arrival. I made tea, a small act of normalcy that helped steady my nerves. As I moved around the kitchen, my kitchen, I mentally prepared for the coming confrontation. Richard Walker was a formidable adversary, a man who had built a real estate empire through equal parts vision and ruthlessness. Unlike Margaret, whose power stemmed largely from social manipulation, Richard's influence was grounded in financial and legal acumen. I was gathering my thoughts when headlights swept across the front windows. Moments later, the doorbell rang. Thomas practically ran to the door. I followed at a deliberate pace, steeling myself for what was to come. Richard Walker entered with the confident stride of a man accustomed to command. Behind him followed 2 men in suits carrying briefcases, the lawyers, presumably. I recognized one as Howard Blackwell, the Walker family's longtime legal counsel. Eliza, Richard greeted me with forced cordiality. I understand we have some matters to discuss. Indeed we do, I replied. maintaining an outward calm I didn't entirely feel. Richard nodded to the lawyers. "Jim, Howard, set up in the dining room, please. We'll join you shortly." As they moved to comply, he turned to Thomas. "I need a word with your mother. Alone." Thomas glanced at me uncertainty, then followed his father into the living room. I remained in the foyer, deliberately giving them space while making it clear I wasn't being banished from my own home. I could hear the murmur of voices, but couldn't make out the words. After a few minutes, Thomas emerged, looking slightly dazed. "Dad wants to speak with you," he said. "In the study." I raised an eyebrow. "My study?" Thomas winced. "Eliza, please. This isn't the time for—" "Fine," I interrupted, moving toward the small room off the living room that had been designated as Thomas's home office. "But I'd like Sophia to join us." "Who?" "My attorney," I replied, pulling out my phone. "I called her on my way to the kitchen. She should be here any minute." Thomas looked alarmed. "You brought a lawyer into this? Dad's not going to like that." "I imagine there are many things your father won't like about this situation," I said evenly. "Having legal representation is the least of them." The doorbell rang again. Thomas looked like he wanted to protest further, but instead he went to answer it. Sophia strode in, professional and poised in a tailored suit despite the late hour, nodding briefly to Thomas before joining me. "Perfect timing," I said as we walked to the study. "Richard just arrived with his lawyers." Sophia squeezed my arm reassuringly. "Remember, legally you're in a strong position. Don't let them intimidate you." We entered the study to find Richard seated behind Thomas's desk, a power move I recognized immediately. I chose not to comment on it, instead taking one of the visitor chairs with Sophia beside me. "I see you've brought counsel," Richard observed, his tone neutral. "Sophia Lynn," my friend introduced herself, placing her business card on the desk, representing Mrs. Walker's interests in this matter. Richard barely glanced at the card. "Unnecessary, but as you wish." He turned his attention to me. "Eliza, Thomas has explained the situation. You've discovered certain legal arrangements that, admittedly, should have been disclosed to you earlier." "Arrangements?" I repeated. "Is that what we're calling identity theft and fraudulent business operations now?" Richard's expression hardened slightly. "That's an extreme characterization. Everything was done legally, with proper documentation. Except for my knowledge or consent," I pointed out. "A regrettable oversight," he conceded, though his tone suggested it was anything but. "One we're prepared to rectify now." "I'm listening." Richard leaned forward. "The assets in question, this house, Chen Design Group, the associated accounts, are part of a comprehensive family asset protection strategy. While they are in your name legally, they were always intended to function as Walker family assets, with the legal ownership providing a liability shield. What we propose is to formalize this understanding with proper agreements, ensuring both protection for the family and appropriate compensation for your role." "My role in a deception I knew nothing about?" Richard's jaw tightened. "In a legal structure that has benefited you considerably. You've lived in this house, enjoyed a comfortable lifestyle, had your career maintained on paper." "Without my knowledge or participation," I interjected. "That's not a benefit, Richard. That's theft of my identity, my professional reputation, and my autonomy." "Eliza," Richard said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone I'd heard countless times at family gatherings. "I understand you're upset, but let's be practical. These assets, while in your name, were acquired with Walker funds and intended for Walker family use. Your actions today, changing bank authorizations, changing locks, are disruptive and potentially damaging to everyone, including yourself." Sophia shifted forward slightly. "Mr. Walker, my client has taken control of assets that are legally hers. There's nothing disruptive about a property owner securing their own property." Richard glanced at her dismissively before returning his attention to me. What exactly do you hope to achieve here, Eliza? Do you imagine you can simply walk away with assets built by the Walker family over generations? I didn't imagine anything of the sort until yesterday, I replied. Until then, I believed what you wanted me to believe, that I was dependent on Walker generosity. It was you who put millions in assets in my name without telling me. For protection, he insisted. It's common practice. What's not common practice is keeping the person whose name is on the documents in the dark, Sophia interjected. That crosses several ethical and potentially legal lines. Richard's composure slipped slightly, revealing a flash of genuine anger. I don't recall asking. For your legal opinion, Ms. Lynn. That's precisely why she's here, I said. Because for 5 years, no one has asked for my opinion on matters directly affecting my life and legal standing. That ends now. A tense silence fell over the room. Richard studied me, as if seeing me for the first time, not as Thomas's compliant wife, but as an adversary who had unexpectedly seized leverage. What do you want? He asked finally, echoing Thomas's earlier question. First, I want to know why, I said. Why go to such lengths to keep me ignorant of my own financial and legal position? Why create an elaborate fiction of a design firm in my name? And most importantly, why exclude me from the succession planning discussions when, apparently, I'm a key component of the plan? Richard exchanged a glance with Thomas, who had been standing silently by the door. Something unspoken passed between them. The succession plan is complex, Richard said carefully. Walker & Sons is transitioning from a family-owned business to a more corporate structure, while maintaining family control of key assets and decisions. The arrangements with your name were part of ensuring certain assets remained protected during this transition. But why the secrecy? I pressed. Why not simply explain this to me and include me in the process? Richard hesitated, and in that hesitation, I felt the edge of a deeper truth he was reluctant to reveal. Because, Thomas said suddenly, the plan includes selling Chen Design Group. I turned to him, confused. Selling a company that doesn't actually exist. It exists on paper, Thomas explained. And it holds valuable intellectual property, sustainable design concepts, green building technologies, proprietary architectural solutions. Dad and I have been positioning it for acquisition by Green Build International. The pieces suddenly clicked into place. You've been using my name, my professional identity, to develop and sell architectural concepts? My concepts? Thomas at least had the grace to look uncomfortable. Not exactly. The concepts were developed by the Walker Design team, but attributed to Chen Design Group for legal and marketing reasons. Greenbuild specifically wanted an independent design firm, not a corporate subdivision. So you created one, I said slowly, using my identity, my professional credentials, without my knowledge. How many of my actual designs from before our marriage were included? The silence that followed was answer enough. That's why I couldn't be involved in the succession planning, I realized. Because I would have discovered that you were selling a company in my name, with my work, without my consent. Richard cleared his throat. The succession plan includes significant compensation for all parties involved, including you. The Greenbuild acquisition is valued at approximately $7 million, with provisions for ongoing royalties. As the nominal owner of Chen Design Group, you would naturally receive appropriate compensation. Nominal owner? I repeated. You mean the actual legal owner whose identity you appropriated? Eliza. Richard's tone hardened. What's done is done. The question now is how we move forward. The Greenbuild deal is set to close next month. It represents a significant opportunity for everyone involved, including you. Walking away from it would be foolish. I looked at Sophia, who gave me a slight nod. We had discussed various scenarios on the phone before her arrival, and this revelation only strengthened my position. I'm not walking away from anything, Richard, I said. standing to signal that our private conversation was over. Let's join the others in the dining room. I think it's time we discuss terms. The dining room had been transformed into an impromptu conference room. Documents were spread across the polished mahogany table, laptops open, legal pads at the ready. Howard Blackwell and the other lawyer, whom Richard introduced as James Mercer, stood as we entered. Margaret was already seated at one end of the table, her face a careful mask of composure. I took my place at the opposite end, with Sophia beside me, a symbolic positioning that wasn't lost on anyone present. Thomas hovered uncertainty for a moment before sitting next to his mother. Richard, naturally, placed himself at the center of the table's long side, effectively controlling the room. Now then, Richard began, all business. We've prepared a series of agreements that should resolve the current misunderstanding. Howard? Howard Blackwell cleared his throat and slid several documents across the table toward me. These are recognition agreements acknowledging the Walker family's beneficial interest in the assets currently held in Mrs. Walker's name, along with authorization forms to restore the previous banking arrangements. Sophia intercepted the documents, before I could touch them, setting them aside without so much as a glance. Before we review any agreements, I think we need clarity on exactly what assets we're discussing and their current valuation. Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The assets are straightforward. This house, valued at approximately $1.8 million. Chen Design Group, with the pending green build offer of $7 million and various accounts totaling roughly $2.3 million. All legally in Eliza's name, but functionally Walker family assets. And what compensation was planned for my client's role in holding these assets? Sophia asked, particularly for the use of her professional identity and work product in Chen Design Group. James Mercer jumped in. As outlined in the succession planning documents, Mrs. Walker would receive a trust allocation of 15% of the proceeds from the Greenbuild acquisition, approximately $1.05 million, to be paid out over 10 years. 15%. I repeated, unable to keep the edge from my voice. For a company built in my name, using my professional reputation, that you're selling for $7 million while keeping me completely in the dark about all of it. Richard raised a placating hand. The allocation reflects the relative contributions. Walker & Sons provided the funding, staffing, and business development for Chen Design Group. The use of your name was a legal convenience, not the core value of the business. A legal convenience for which you were willing to pay me over $1 million, I observed. That suggests my name had significant value. The allocation is generous, Richard insisted, particularly given that you've contributed nothing to the actual operation of the company, because you deliberately excluded me from it, I pointed out, while simultaneously pressuring me to leave my actual career to support Thomas and the Walker family business. Margaret shifted uncomfortably in her seat. I realized that aspects of this arrangement might be news to her as well. Thomas stared, down at the table, avoiding eye contact with anyone. What exactly are you proposing, Eliza? Richard asked, his patience visibly wearing thin. I looked at Sophia, who gave me an encouraging nod. Let's be clear about the current situation, I began. I legally own assets worth approximately $11 million, assets that you placed in my name without my knowledge, while systematically making me believe I was financially dependent on your family's generosity. You've used my professional identity to build a business you're now selling for a substantial profit. And you've excluded me from decisions directly affecting my legal and financial standing. Richard started to interrupt, but I held up a hand, surprising myself with my own authority. I'm not finished. You created this situation, Richard. You chose to put these assets in my name. You chose to keep me in the dark. Now you're facing the consequences of those choices. Are you threatening us? Richard's voice had a dangerous edge. I'm stating facts, I replied calmly. Facts that would look very concerning to the SEC, the State Licensing Board for Architects, and possibly the district attorney, should they come to light. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Howard Blackwell leaned over to whisper something to Richard, who waved him off impatiently. "What do you want?" Richard asked again, this time with barely contained anger. "First, I want full transparency. All documentation related to Chen Design Group, its operations, contracts, and the pending Greenbuild deal. Second, I want a fair allocation of the proceeds. 65% seems appropriate given that it's my name, my professional identity, and apparently some of my actual work that's being sold." 65%? Richard practically sputtered. "That's outrageous." "Third," I continued as if he hadn't spoken, "I want the house transferred into a new trust that I control, with provisions for Thomas as my spouse, but no involvement from the broader Walker family. Fourth, I want a formal acknowledgement that I was kept deliberately ignorant of these arrangements, signed by both you and Thomas." "Absolutely not," Richard snapped. "You're overplaying your hand, Eliza. We can fight this in court if necessary." "You could," Sophia interjected smoothly, "but consider the implications. A public legal battle over what amounts to identity theft and professional fraud? The damage to Walker & Sons' reputation would be substantial. Not to mention what Greenbuild might think about discovering the company they're acquiring was built on deception." I could see Richard calculating the risks, weighing them against his pride and sense of control. Margaret placed a hand on his arm, a silent caution against rash decisions. "We need to discuss this privately," Richard finally said. "Of course," I agreed. "Sophia and I will wait in the kitchen." As we left the room, I heard the murmur of urgent conversation begin immediately. In the kitchen, Sophia squeezed my arm. Encouragingly, "You're doing brilliantly," she whispered. "They're on the defensive now." "Do you think they'll agree?" I asked, suddenly uncertain. "Not everything," she admitted. "But they're in a weak position legally, and they know it. The reputational risk alone is significant. I suspect they'll counter with something substantial." 20 minutes later, Thomas appeared in the kitchen doorway. His expression was unreadable. "Dad wants to make a counterproposal," he said. We returned to the dining room to find Richard looking composed again, his moment of anger contained behind his usual mask of business confidence. "We'll agree to 40% of the Greenbuild proceeds paid immediately upon closing rather than over 10 years, he offered. "The house stays in your name, with acknowledgement of Thomas's spousal interest but no other Walker family involvement. The other accounts will be divided equally. Half to remain in your control, half to return to Walker family management." "And the acknowledgement of my deliberate exclusion?" I asked. Richard's expression hardened. "That's a non-starter. We'll acknowledge that communication could have been better, but nothing that suggests impropriety." I looked at Sophia, who gave a slight shrug. "It's a reasonable counter," she murmured. "The financial terms are fair." I studied Richard's face, then Thomas's, then Margaret's. The family dynamics that had shaped the last 5 years of my life were suddenly visible in stark relief. Richard's need for control, Margaret's investment in family hierarchy, Thomas's conflict between loyalty to his parents and commitment to his wife. 50% of the Greenbuild proceeds, I countered, and a written statement that I was not informed of the full extent of assets held in my name, signed by Thomas and Richard. Not an admission of wrongdoing, just an acknowledgement of the facts. Richard and Howard conferred briefly in whispers. Finally, Richard nodded. "Acceptable. Howard will draft the agreements tonight. We can sign them tomorrow." "There's one more thing," I said. "From now on, I want actual involvement in any business that bears my name. No more decisions about my professional identity without my knowledge or consent." Richard studied me for a long moment, as if seeing me through new eyes. "That can be arranged," he said finally. "You have more business acumen than I gave you credit for, Eliza." It wasn't an apology. I doubted Richard Walker had apologized to anyone in decades, but it was an acknowledgement, however reluctant, of my capabilities. As the lawyers began gathering their materials and discussing logistics for the next day's signing, I felt a strange mixture of triumph and sadness. I had won a significant victory, secured my financial independence, and forced the Walker family to recognize my autonomy. But the cost had been the illusion of family belonging I'd clung to for 5 years. Thomas approached me as the others filed, out of the dining room. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly. "Privately?" I nodded, leading him to the living room while the lawyers continued their discussions in the foyer. "What happens to us now?" he asked once we were alone, his voice uncertain. It was the question I'd been avoiding all day, the one I still wasn't sure how to answer. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily, marking the seconds of silence between us. Thomas stood by the fireplace, hands in his pockets, waiting for an answer I didn't have. What did happen to us now? The financial aspects had been resolved with surprising efficiency. I was now officially wealthy in my own right, no longer dependent on Walker family generosity, real or imagined. But the deeper breach of trust remained, a chasm between us that money couldn't bridge. "I don't know, Thomas," I said finally. 5 years of marriage, and I just discovered that you've been lying to me the entire time." "Not lying," he protested weakly, "just not telling you everything. You created a company in my name without telling me. You put our house in my name without telling me. You forged my signature on documents. You let me believe I was financially dependent on you when legally I owned everything." I shook my head. "If that's not lying, what is?" Thomas sank into an armchair, suddenly looking exhausted. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he said. "Dad approached me right after our engagement with the asset protection plan. It made sense legally. You weren't connected to Walker & Sons, so putting certain assets in your name created a clean separation. I didn't think about how it would affect you, about what it would mean to keep you in the dark." For 5 years, he ran a hand through his hair. It just continued. The longer it went on, the harder it was to explain. And then when Dad started developing Chen Design Group as a separate entity, using your architecture background as the foundation, it became even more complicated. "You're still not answering the real question," I said. "Why not just tell me? Why create this elaborate fiction where I believed I was living on your generosity when legally I owned everything?" Thomas was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Control, I suppose. Dad's always controlled everything. The business, the family dynamics, everything. He taught me that's what it means to be the head of a family, to manage things for everyone's benefit. Without their knowledge or consent," he winced. "It sounds terrible when you put it that way. Because it is terrible, Thomas. It's manipulative and dishonest." I moved to the window, looking out at the darkened garden. "The thing is, I understand why your father did it. Richard has always been ruthlessly practical, willing to do whatever it takes to protect and expand the Walker empire. But you? You were my husband, my partner. You were supposed to be on my side." "I am on your side, Eliza. I've always been on your side." I turned to face him. "No, you've been on your father's side, implementing his vision of what our marriage should be. A marriage where I'm kept ignorant of my own financial and legal reality, where I'm made to feel grateful for things that are actually mine." "That's not fair," Thomas protested. "I've always tried to balance what Dad wanted with what was best for us." "And keeping me in the dark was best for us?" He hesitated. I thought it was simpler that way. You weren't interested in the business side of things, because you and your family actively discouraged my participation. The frustration I'd been controlling all evening finally spilled over. You nudged me out of my career, involved me only when you needed my expertise, and then have the audacity to claim I wasn't interested? You created that situation, Thomas. You and your parents. Thomas stood, moving toward me with his hands outstretched. Eliza, please. I know I've made mistakes, serious ones, but I love you. I've always loved you. We can fix this, start fresh, with everything out in the open. I stepped back, avoiding his touch. It's not that simple. This isn't just about asset management or legal structures. It's about 5 years of systematic deception. It's about you allowing your mother to make me feel like a guest in what was legally my own home. It's about you watching me doubt myself, my worth, my place in this family, when all along, you knew the truth. Thomas's face fell. What are you saying? I'm saying I need time. Time to process everything that's happened. Time to figure out who I am outside of the fiction you and your family created. What does that mean, practically speaking? I took a deep breath, voicing the decision I'd been forming all evening. It means I won't be here when you get back from Aspen. I'm going to stay with Sophia for a while, at least until I figure out my next steps. You're leaving? The disbelief in his voice was almost childlike. I'm taking a step back, I clarified. I need space, Thomas. Space to rediscover who Eliza Chen is without Walker family expectations shaping every aspect of my life. He looked stricken. This is because of the house, the company. No, I interrupted. It's because of the deception. It's because for 5 years you've been complicit in a system designed to keep me dependent and grateful, when legally I had every right to independence. How can I trust you after that? How can I believe anything about our marriage was real? It was real, Thomas insisted, his voice breaking. My feelings for you have always been real. Maybe, I conceded. But they weren't enough to make you treat me as an equal partner deserving of honesty and respect. There was nothing more to say. Thomas eventually left the room, and I heard him climb the stairs to the guest bedroom. We'd sleep separately tonight, the first physical manifestation of the distance that had always existed between us, though I'd been blind to it until now. Early the next morning, I packed a small suitcase. Just essentials: clothes, toiletries, my architectural sketchbooks that had gathered dust for years. The rest could wait until I had a clearer plan. Thomas was already gone, having left for his office before dawn. A note on the kitchen counter said simply, "I'll be back for the signing at 2 Sawao. We can talk more then." Sophia arrived at 9, helping me load my things into her car. "Are you sure about this?" she asked as I took one last look around the house. My house legally, though it had never truly felt like home. "I'm sure I need space," I replied. "The rest, I'll figure it out as I go." We drove to her downtown loft, a spacious, art-filled space that reflected her independent spirit. After settling me in the guest room, she had to leave for a court appearance. "Make yourself at home," she said. "I'll be back by noon, and we can go to the signing together." Alone in her apartment, I found myself drawn to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. From this height, I could see the distinctive silhouette of the Mason Building, where Chen Design Group had its offices. My offices, technically, though I'd only set foot in them once. On impulse, I called a rideshare and headed downtown. 20 minutes later, I was standing outside Suite 305, the frosted glass door bearing my maiden name still strange and familiar at once. Mia looked up in surprise as I entered. "Mrs. Walker, I wasn't expecting you today." "Actually," I said, a sudden feeling of rightness washing over me. "It's Ms. Chen, at least professionally. Is anyone else here today?" "No, just me," she replied, clearly confused by the change. "Mr. Thomas called this morning and said there might be some changes coming, but he didn't explain." "There are definitely changes coming," I confirmed, starting with me taking a more active role in the business. "Could you give me a tour? I'd like to understand exactly what we do here." For the next hour, Mia walked me through the operations of Chen Design Group. Despite its fictional nature, the company had developed genuine sustainable architecture solutions, had real clients, mostly subsidiaries of Walker & Sons, and had built a solid professional reputation. In the private office, I settled behind the desk, my desk, and opened the portfolio of current projects. The designs were impressive, incorporating cutting-edge green technology with elegant functional spaces. Some incorporated elements reminiscent of my own style from my days at Morrison, though adapted and evolved. As I studied the drawings, I felt something stir within me, the creative spark I'd suppressed for years while trying to fit into the Walker family mold. These designs, created in my name without my knowledge, paradoxically reconnected me to the passion I'd set aside. By the time I left to meet Sophia for the signing, I had made another decision. One that would shape not just my financial future, but my professional identity as well. At precisely 2 p.m., I walked into the Walker & Sons corporate headquarters for the signing. Richard, Thomas, Howard, and James were already in the conference room, documents spread across the table. I took my seat beside Sophia, who had already reviewed the final agreements. "Everything's in order," she confirmed quietly. 50% of the green build proceeds, full control of the house, half the accounts, and the acknowledgement statement we requested. I nodded, then addressed the room. "Before we sign, there's one more thing I want to discuss." Richard frowned. "The terms have been agreed upon, Eliza. This isn't the time for renegotiation." "I'm not changing the financial terms," I clarified. "I'm adding a professional element. I spent the morning at Chen Design Group reviewing the current projects and operations." Thomas looked surprised. "You went to the office?" "Yes. And I've made a decision. I want to take an active role in the company moving forward, not just as a name on paper, but as the actual creative director." Richard's frown deepened. "The Greenbuild deal is nearly finalized. They're acquiring the company as it currently operates." "Then they'll be getting an upgrade," I said firmly. "An architecture firm with its actual namesake at the helm, bringing fresh perspective and genuine expertise. I've already spoken with Mia about the transition. I'm confident it will only increase the company's value." Thomas was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, surprise mixed with something else. Pride, perhaps? Or simply resignation to this new assertive version of his wife? Richard studied me for a long moment, his business mind clearly calculating the potential benefits and risks. Finally, he nodded. "I'll have to discuss this with Greenbuild, but I don't foresee objections. Your actual involvement might even strengthen the deal." "Good," I said. "Then let's sign." As I put my name to the documents, my actual signature, not a forgery, I felt a sense of completion. Not an ending, but a beginning. I was reclaiming not just my financial independence, but my professional identity, my creative passion, my sense of self. Thomas caught up with me as I was leaving. "What does this mean for us?" he asked, the same question from last night still hanging between us. I met his gaze directly. "I don't know yet, but I do know this. If we have any future together, it will be as equals. No more secrets, no more manipulation, no more playing along with your family's power dynamics. I need to rediscover who Eliza Chen is first, before I can decide if there's still room in her life for Eliza Walker." He nodded slowly, accepting this new reality. "And the Aspen trip? The family retreat?" "Go," I said. "Have your succession planning discussions. But understand that whatever plans you make, whatever decisions you reach, they don't include controlling me anymore. I'll be making my own decisions from now on." As I walked out of Walker & Sons headquarters, I felt lighter than I had in years. The future was uncertain, my marriage in limbo. But for the first time since I'd met Thomas, I was truly in control of my own life. Margaret's words echoed in my mind. "Remember, dear, this is Thomas's house. He's worked so hard for it." The irony wasn't lost on me. The house had been mine all along, just as my life, my career, my identity had always been mine. I'd simply allowed others to convince me otherwise. Never again. The Chen Design Group offices looked completely different. Now, gone were the generic furnishings and bland corporate art, replaced by an environment that reflected my actual aesthetic. Sustainable materials, clean lines, and strategic splashes of color. The design library I'd installed along the back wall housed an extensive collection of books on green architecture, urban planning, and sustainable technologies. Most importantly, the walls now displayed genuine projects I had personally overseen, not just designs appropriated from my past. I set my coffee mug down on my desk, a beautiful reclaimed wood piece I'd commissioned from a local artisan, and reviewed the latest designs for the Riverfront Commons project. It was our largest undertaking since the Greenbuild acquisition, a mixed-use development that would showcase cutting-edge sustainability practices while providing affordable housing options in the city center. Ms. Chen. Mia appeared in the doorway. She'd stayed on as my office manager, proving to be exceptionally capable once freed from Thomas's micromanagement. Your 10 o'clock is here. Send them in, I replied, gathering my notes for the meeting. The past year had been transformative. After the agreements were signed, I'd thrown myself into revitalizing Chen Design Group. When Greenbuild completed their acquisition 3 months later, they were buying a very different company than the one they'd initially targeted, one with its namesake founder actively involved and bringing fresh energy and vision. As part of the deal, I'd negotiated to stay on as creative director for a minimum of 2 years. The arrangement had worked beautifully, with Greenbuild providing the broader platform and resources while I guided the creative direction. My reputation in sustainable architecture had been reestablished, with several industry publications featuring profiles on my return to professional practice. Financially, I was more than secure. The Greenbuild proceeds, combined with my salary and the other assets I'd retained, meant I never had to worry about money again. I'd donated a significant portion to a scholarship fund for women in architecture and used another chunk to buy a modest but beautiful loft downtown, a space that was entirely mine, decorated to my taste, with no Walker family influence whatsoever. As for Thomas, we hadn't formally separated, but we hadn't reconciled either. He'd returned from the Aspen retreat to find me gone as promised. In the months that followed, we'd developed a cautious, slightly awkward relationship. Not quite husband and wife, not quite estranged, somewhere in a liminal space between. He'd surprised me in some ways. Instead of fighting my independence or trying to pressure me to return, he'd given me the space I'd asked for. He'd even defended my position to his parents when Richard complained about my hijacking of Chen Design Group before the sale. We met occasionally for dinner, keeping each other updated on our lives. The conversations were stilted at first, but gradually became more natural. Thomas seemed different, more thoughtful, less reflexively deferential to his father's worldview. He'd taken on a new development project focused on revitalizing a neglected neighborhood, something he genuinely seemed passionate about rather than just another Walker family profit center. My thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. I looked up to see Thomas standing there, exactly on time for our scheduled meeting. "Good morning," he said, his smile a bit tentative. "Morning," I replied, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. "Thanks for coming in." This wasn't just a personal visit. The Riverfront Commons project was a joint venture between Greenbuild and Walker & Sons, with Thomas representing his family's interests. Our professional paths had crossed again, but this time on equal footing. "I reviewed your revised plans," he said, setting his portfolio on the desk. "The integration of the community gardens with the residential towers is brilliant. Dad's actually impressed, though he'd never admit it directly." I smiled at that. Richard Walker's grudging respect had been an unexpected development. After initial resistance to my involvement in Chen Design Group, he'd come to recognize the value I brought. We'd never be close. The deception ran too deep for that. But we'd reached a state of mutual professional respect. Margaret was another story. She'd never forgiven me for what she saw as a betrayal of the Walker family, despite the fact that she'd been kept in the dark about the financial arrangements just as I had. Our encounters at the occasional unavoidable social event were icily polite at best. "How's the house?" Thomas asked, shifting to more personal territory once we'd worked through the professional details. "It sold last month," I replied. "Above asking price." I'd finally decided to sell the Tudor home in Oak Ridge Heights. Despite legally owning it, I'd never felt comfortable there. It represented too much of the past, of the life where I'd been manipulated and contained. "I saw that." Thomas nodded. "And your loft? Everything working out there?" "Perfectly," I said. "I can walk to the office. I'm close to galleries and restaurants. And best of all, it's completely mine." Thomas winced slightly at that, but didn't argue. He'd come to understand, I think, how important genuine ownership was to me now. Not just legal ownership, but the emotional and psychological sense of having spaces and decisions that were truly mine. "I've been thinking," he said after a pause. "It's been almost a year since everything. Maybe it's time we made some decisions about us, about whether there still is an us." I'd been expecting this conversation. The limbo we'd been living in couldn't continue indefinitely. "What are you thinking?" I asked. "I miss you," he said simply. "I miss our life together. But I also understand why that life can't continue the way it was. I've changed, Eliza. Or at least, I'm trying to." "In what ways?" I asked, needing more than vague assurances. "I've pulled back from some of the family business," he explained. "Established more boundaries with Dad. I turned down the role in the Asian expansion to focus on the neighborhood revitalization project, something I actually believe in rather than just another Walker conquest. And I've been seeing a therapist, trying to understand the patterns I grew up with and how they affected our marriage." This was news. Thomas had always dismissed therapy as unnecessary, another Walker family value. "That's significant," I acknowledged. "I'm not asking you to come back to what we had before," he continued. "That marriage was built on deception, and it can't be salvaged. But maybe we could start something new, something honest, between equals this time." I studied him, trying to gauge his sincerity. The Thomas sitting across from me was different from the man I'd left a year ago. Humbler, more self-aware, less automatically aligned with his family's perspective. But was it enough? "I don't know, Thomas," I said honestly. "I've rebuilt my life in a way that works for me. I'm not sure I want to risk that." He nodded, accepting this without protest. "I understand. But would you consider dating? Getting to know each other again, slowly, without expectations? We could see if there's still something worth building, something healthier this time." I couldn't help but smile at the idea. Dating. My own husband. Starting fresh as if we were new to each other. In some ways we were. The Eliza sitting behind this desk was not the same woman who had tried so hard to fit into the Walker family mold. And Thomas seemed genuinely different as, "Well, I could consider that," I said finally. "But with conditions. My career, my home, my independence, those aren't negotiable. And any relationship between us has to be completely separate from Walker family dynamics." "Agreed," he said quickly. "Completely separate. This would be about us, not about family, business or assets or control." I felt a flicker of hope, small but genuine. "Then yes, we can try dating, starting fresh." Thomas's smile was the most genuine I'd seen from him in years. "Dinner Friday? I know a great new place downtown, near your loft." "That sounds like a good start," I agreed. After he left, I turned back to the window, gazing out at the city skyline. I couldn't predict whether Thomas and I would find our way back to each other, or if this new beginning would simply confirm that our paths had permanently diverged. But for the first time, the decision would be truly mine, made from a position of strength and independence rather than vulnerability and deception. Margaret's words still echoed occasionally. Remember, dear, this is Thomas's house. He's worked so hard for it. But they no longer had the power to make me doubt myself or my place in the world, because I knew the truth now. The house hadn't been Thomas's. My career hadn't been just a convenient cover story. My identity wasn't something to be borrowed and used for Walker family purposes. They had always been mine. And now, finally, I was reclaiming them, on my terms, by my choice, as Eliza Chen. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.